Welcome to Women of Washington with Aileen Black and Gigi Shum on Federal News Radio 1500 AM. Women of Washington is a series of weekly radio interviews with Washington, D.C.'s most ambitious and influential female executives, role models for the next generation of Washington leaders. Every Wednesday morning at 9, Aileen and Gigi interview the most accomplished women in Washington who share their life lessons and secrets to success.
I'm Aileen Black.
I'm Gigi Shum.
Today in the studio we have Lori Garver, General Manager of Airline Pilots Association and former Deputy Administrator of NASA. Our guest today's career spans over 30 years in both the private and the public sector. Today, Lori is General Manager of the Airline Pilots Association. Prior to that, she was nominated by President Obama back in May 2009 and was the Deputy Administrator of NASA. Garver led both the Civil Space Policy Advisors for Obama's 2008 political campaign and led the agency's review team for NASA during the post-election transition. Lori has had numerous positions in the space policy. She was a member of NASA Advisory Council, a guest lecturer at the International Space University, president and board member of the Women in Aerospace, and president of the American Astronautical Society. Lori has a BA from Colorado College and a master's from George Washington University. Welcome, Lori.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Lori, I see that in the early 80s, right out of school, armed with your degrees in political science and economics, you went to work on Capitol Hill in John Glenn's office when he was in the Senate. Is that when you found your love of space and Washington?
Well, I like to think that I've been a big fan, as are a lot of us, of the space program and of our exploration activities beyond the planet Earth for longer than that. Growing up, I was 8 when Neil and Buzz walked on the moon, and I guess I always felt I would get that chance. So working for John Glenn was a thrill, and it did sort of cement a lot of those thoughts in my mind that I wanted to do that in my career.
That was quite a leap at 8 to think that you might get the chance to do that, because even today there are few females up on the Hill and fewer in space. So what was it that made you think that you could be part of that? And how was it back then?
Well, I think all of us grow up certainly with a view that we are going to be part of the broader society, whatever interests us. And so it interested me, and I didn't really feel like there were going to be limits because I was a girl. My mom certainly never instilled that in me. And throughout college, I did not have that. Sally Ride flew in space when I was just graduating from college, and it did seem like a natural thing to do. Of course, coming to Washington on the Hill and in the space program, I've been for the entire 30 years, unfortunately, one of the few women in the room, and I'm hoping, of course, that will change faster than it has the last 30 years, but it's changed some.
Lori, I know that Sally Ride was an early inspiration, not only from your blog, but what you just mentioned, and possibly a mentor to you. How did Sally help shape your career?
Well, while she was an inspiration in college, I definitely felt like I probably would never get to meet her. And the opportunity when I was both at the National Space Society and NASA to start working with her directly was something that she completely fulfilled for me as a mentor, a woman who had decided that she was going to be in a field, went out to do that, and I had the chance, especially during the transition team and as the deputy of NASA, to work with her closely. She helped shape the space program. She really molded a lot of my thoughts on what we should be doing in space, and I'll be forever grateful.
Speaking of what we should be doing in space, you were deputy administrator at NASA during a very interesting time. The Cold War had ended, and we'd begun to cooperate with Russia on several projects, including the space station. How did that change NASA's mission?
NASA has always been a geopolitical tool for the United States. Certainly going to Apollo, going to the moon through the Apollo program was a geopolitical response to Sputnik, and the Russians, with Yuri Gagarin's flight, caused us to invest heavily in the space program. So when we had a situation where we could help advance peaceful cooperation through space, we were right there willing to do that. It was an amazing time to be in my early days at NASA in the 90s there as we first went to Star City, first saw where cosmonauts were trained. I actually trained in multi-gravity accelerator myself in Star City, Russia, on my 40th birthday. So the opening up of the Russian space program to the United States, and now what has been a very successful cooperative relationship, has advanced the space program. It's something that, while we recognize we need to probably invest in some of these activities more ourselves, the cooperative nature of it has been very positive.
Given the situation in Ukraine, are you concerned about our reliance on Russian right now?
Sure. We should have always been concerned. We were always concerned. It's a partnership, but of course, to have a strong partnership, you need to have your own capability. And while retirement of the shuttle was something that was planned for a long time, it was done for a lot of the right reasons. The mistakes, in my view, were not to be funding earlier the follow-on to the shuttle so that we didn't have to pay the Russians for our astronauts to fly in space. We're now on a very positive track to get our astronauts flying in space through these commercial vehicles. We should have been funding that earlier, and we wouldn't have had this gap. But we did have a gap also between Apollo and shuttle. And with the nation's investment in space, it's very hard to both fly out major expensive missions and develop new ones at the same time. So there have been these gaps.
Today, we're talking with Lori Garver, General Manager of the Airline Pilots Association and former Deputy Administrator of NASA. Coming up, we talk with Lori about the Dragon space vehicle and NASA's changing mission. You're listening to Women of Washington with Aileen Black and Gigi Shum on Federal News Radio 1500 AM.
Federal News Radio's DoD Wednesday. At 3 on Wednesdays, DoD reporter Jared Serbu hosts On DoD, a discussion with senior managers about how the department meets its mission. At 4, in-depth host Francis Rose brings you Pentagon Solutions, a smart discussion on the issues and challenges of the defense community. Plus daily DoD updates, mornings and afternoons at 37 past the hour. DoD Wednesday on 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com.
Welcome back. You're listening to Women of Washington with Aileen Black and Gigi Shum on Federal News Radio 1500 AM. Today we're talking to Lori Garver, General Manager and Airline Pilots Association and former Deputy Administrator of NASA. Lori, I recently saw a picture of you sitting in the Dragon V2. In our last segment we were talking about, NASA allowing industry to take a greater role. First, tell us about that vehicle and tell us what you see as being an opportunity for us.
So NASA is helping to seed funding for commercial vehicles to follow on the space shuttle program and to be able to start paying American companies rather than Russia for astronauts to go to and from space. So right now there's competition. There are 3 finalists in this competition. There will be a down select this summer, so it's a really exciting time. So they're all marketing their vehicles. I want you to know I have also sat in the Boeing CX-100, which is their capsule that would compete to have our astronauts go to the space station. And I just, with my son, was able to sit in the Dragon V2, which is their version of their competition for that vehicle. Sierra Nevada is the 3rd competitor, and their vehicle is called the Dream Chaser. So in my view, this is the perfect way that NASA can help advance our technology in this country, our capability in space, and help us sustain an exploration program that will have not just the taxpayers paying for this, but the private sector as well. There are new markets in space. We, as a society, I think, have seen, again, since we were little, growing up with the space program, an interest in people being able to do this more than just those couple of people a year who work for the government. So it's an exciting time, and I'm looking forward to those vehicles coming online.
So you're talking about an exciting time that also will create a whole vast number of new opportunities or jobs for our listeners out there. Do you think this is a great time to get into the industry, the space industry?
I do. We have had a wonderful last 50 years of human space exploration. I think we are at a turning point where there are going to be more people going into space, as I said, than just government employees. And the only way to do that is to reduce the cost. We have had a couple of tourists who have paid the Russians to go. I was one who made an attempt to go on that program more than 10 years ago. But really, as the space program develops, this is the proper role of government. We invest in advanced technologies. We help prove those technologies, which allow our industry to succeed, opening new markets, putting their own innovation into these activities, and thereby reducing the costs, and then able to compete more broadly. So we know with communication satellites, remote sensing, global positioning satellites, these were all government funded initially and are now great economic boons to this country, creating certainly hundreds of billions of economic activity and tens of thousands of jobs.
So, Lori, it sounds like you're a fan of the privatization of some of space travel. And as that becomes more and more the purview of the private sector, how, in your opinion, is that going to change NASA's mission? What should then NASA be doing in the future?
Well, again, I think this is really a trajectory we've been on since the beginning. As the government funds those more difficult tasks, those tasks that take more technological advancement, we know that private sector comes in later. So NASA needs to just be pushing the technology further. So at this point, we've been having humans travel in space for 50 years. It's all right to loosen our grip on that and have our own industry take a little more responsibility for it. Contractors have been involved since the very beginning. NASA has never built any of this themselves. We work with the private sector. So we're now going to be able to do that with human spaceflight as well. But NASA then can continue to advance our robotic program, the Mars rovers. We'd like to go see more closely some of the things we have discovered through our advanced telescopes like the Hubble and the Kepler telescope. We'll be launching the Webb telescope in just a couple of years, which has the potential to see the first Earth-like planet circling a distant star. Those are very exciting things for NASA as we expand further with robots, with humans following. That has been our position for NASA's entire history. The first A in NASA, should also not forget, is aeronautics. NASA has advanced aeronautics to the point where commercial aviation, where I work now, is a world leader, and they need to continue to do that. And then finally, earth sciences. Having satellites look back at our fragile planet is something NASA has done since the beginning, and we advance those technologies to do that in a way that helps us understand our changing planet.
Today we're talking with Lori Garver, General Manager of the Airline Pilots Association and former Deputy Administrator for NASA.
Lori, one of your last major projects at NASA, which I found completely fascinating, was the asteroid redirect mission. Can you tell us a little about this project and why grab an asteroid?
Sure. You know, there are a lot of things that are important about space and discovery, but one of them certainly is to learn more about asteroids. We know they've had a great impact on our planet and life on it in the past, and undoubtedly will in the future. So how do we understand these? We get up close. We try to manipulate them to be able to, in the future, whether it's 50 years, 1,000 years, or longer, have the ability that I think a large number of the public believes we should be working on to redirect an asteroid should we find something really is coming our way. So being able to go out to a smaller asteroid, get close to it, and manipulate it has been a long-term goal, and we're now to the point where we could do that. NASA is developing a couple programs where astronauts could go too, but we could also do it remotely. We have a mission right now to an asteroid called OSIRIS-REx that is completely robotic, and it could be followed up by this asteroid redirect mission with astronauts going out and inspecting it. Not only will asteroids have the potential to negatively impact us, but you could use resources on asteroids for developing space further. There's a lot of thoughts about, as humanity over the longer term ventures out into space, explores and develops space, you're not going to be launching all those resources from Earth. And asteroids are of great interest for that reason as well. And the final reason is new knowledge and discovery. We believe that asteroids or comets may have been responsible for seeding life on this planet. So the very origins of life could exist in asteroids. So for me, it's a natural area of study for NASA at this time.
And Lori, it almost sounds like a plot for a movie, an amazing program and project as I read about it. Do you think Capitol Hill's ready to understand the value of this and helping change the funding that's associated with NASA's programs, its missions, and allowing them to pursue projects like this?
People on the Hill are struggling with a transition that is natural. The government is there to sort of support the status quo, and it's very hard to challenge status quo funding. Those companies that have large contracts do not give them up lightly. They pay for millions of dollars in lobbyists who then have congressmen who want to support those programs. So doing new things is hard. But I am optimistic and think those things will change as we have not only the private sector, but some of these more unique technology programs like asteroid research increasing. The public should be seeing and hopefully letting their members of Congress know that these are valuable missions for NASA. I know there are a number of existing contracts and jobs that it's easier to support for a couple members, but I think if you took a poll of all of Congress, they would want to do those things that are of the greatest value to humankind and to our future. And to me, that is helping our national economic future, which in turn helps our national security future, as well as new discovery and leaving the world better than we found it.
Lori, shifting gears a bit, you've spoken and you've written extensively on a whole wide variety of topics. I read blogs where you talk about space travel and the role of NASA, but you also have written about unions, the Defense of Marriage Act. It seems like you are not afraid to tackle any topic at all. That's not a trait that we typically see here in Washington. So how have you decided to be so bold?
I don't know how else to be, and I would say that we have lots of examples of people being bold. When I was nominated by the president to be the deputy administrator of NASA, I took that oath very, very seriously. And as a leader of an $18 billion agency, 18,000 people, 40,000 contractors, I was not just speaking on behalf of exploration or human exploration, but more broadly. We had half our members in unions. We had people who were being harmed by existing laws relating to their insurance, human rights issues. Those, as a leader, and the Obama administration very, very clearly set out an agenda and goals for us, and I took that role very seriously as a political appointee. I understand that doesn't always make you popular, and the president said to each of us in our positions numerous times together and to me several times alone, thank you for doing that. I understand you're taking the arrows. It's important. We come to Washington, I think most of us, because we want to make a difference, and it's important. And you don't do that without being bold and breaking a few rice bowls.
So it sounds like this has been, part of you, imprinted on you from the beginning. Do your parents, did they, as a parent out there, both Gigi and I have 4 children each, 8 between each of us. Many listeners out there are raising young women right now. Is there things that your parents did for you that helped give you that confidence to be able to speak your mind like that so freely and help, make a difference?
I'm sure they did. My parents both gave me a sense of security and knowing that I was going to be able to make my own way and my own decisions. I try to do that with my own 2 children. It's hard, and I appreciate that my parents have done that. I should make sure I tell them that again all the time. I also had a grandfather and an uncle who were in public service. They were in the state legislature in Michigan, kept a seat over 40 years, really just to pass better laws for their neighboring farmers. This was not a full-time job, of course, the state house in Michigan. And I grew up thinking, of course, part of your responsibility is public service and to make a difference. And it was unique that I made that switch to do it in science, technology, policy, where I got my master's, now in aviation and space policy, where I believe our nation has been leaders. I'd like to see us continue that leadership because it is responsible for a great amount of our success. The technological advancement that's come from these programs have left the world better. So I feel strongly about it. I'm sure there are seeds of that. back in mid-Michigan, and I hope that I have seeded that in my children. So far, they seem to have no problem standing up for themselves.
Today, we're talking with Lori Garver, General Manager of the Airline Pilots Association and former Deputy Administrator of NASA. Next, we'll talk with Lori about mentorship and STEM careers for women. You're listening to Women of Washington with Aileen Black and Gigi Shum on Federal News Radio 1500 AM.
Management Friday on Federal News Radio. Friday mornings at 10, listen for the American Federation of Government Employee Workforce Perspective on Inside Government. Next at 11, Shaw, Bransford, and Roth talk about the legal implications of management decisions on Fed Talk. And at noon, listen for Fed Access with Derek T. Dortch to learn the best career path for you. Management Friday on Federal News Radio 1500 AM and federalnewsradio.com.
Welcome back. You're listening to Women of Washington with Aileen Black and Gigi Shum on Federal News Radio 1500 AM. Today, we're talking with Lori Garver, General Manager, Airline Pilots Association and former Deputy Administrator of NASA. Lori, Charlie Bolden, NASA Administrator, once described you as a great leader and role model for girls interested in science, technology, and engineering. We talked about Sally Ride earlier. Have you had other role models or mentors, and if so, who were they?
Of course, role models are very important. For me, Hillary Clinton has been a role model since I first heard of her. Again, getting to meet her later in my career has been amazing, and then I worked for her on the presidential campaign before making the transition, as did she, as we all did, to President Obama. And I would also add Senator Barbara Mikulski. She has championed NASA. She has championed my work at NASA. She was great friends with Sally Ride, and she's head of our Appropriations Committee, and was someone whose toughness and tenacity has shown, I think, how much someone can really make a difference in this town as a woman when that was even harder when she first started.
Do you have any specific advice that you think would be valuable to share with women about how to build their careers?
I try to mentor women whenever possible. We have of course, March is Women's History Month, and NASA established a number of programs to help women get into these fields. But generally, with career and time management, my advice tends to be pretty predictable, like others. You really need, and it's more so as a woman, but everyone can take this advice, to be able to enter a field where you're going to have an interest and staying in that field. It is something you spend a lot of your time doing. You're going to be making choices about spending time there versus your family, and so it better be something that you really feel is important and love. And I think across the board, that's something that I continue to try and let younger people know. And for women specifically, I believe that they should not be afraid to enter fields where there are fewer women. I do find that there's a lot of openness to it in science technology, and I hope more will pursue it.
If you find your passion, you can find success, because then work is fun, right? And right now in this industry, there's so many jobs opening up, and the STEM background type positions. That is really sage advice.
So, Laura, you've had a great career, and primarily in the public sector, although not right now. Would you, given everything that's going on in Washington today, budget cuts and sequestration and the fighting up on Capitol Hill, would you recommend a young woman today pursue a career in the federal government?
I absolutely would. Great turmoil like this can lead to even greater opportunity, and this is a time for leadership, and women need to be trained as leaders. We make amazing leaders. We're collaborative, and I think able, as we've seen from the female leaders in government, to make a great difference. The government, in my view, having served in both public and private sectors, is a little ahead of the private sector, frankly, in having female leaders. If you look, the cabinet and the deputies and in even the House and Senate, they're higher percentages than are in boardrooms across the country. And so we are modeling that, and I still think it's a great career.
You bring up a really good point. You're now in the airline industry. and their statistics are not as good. Like many private sector industries, they're not as good as public sector. I think I read that there are fewer than 4% of key positions in the airline industry that are held by women. So do you think that's changing? And I guess what advice, given your background in public sector, would you give executives in the airline industry to help them tap that rich talent pool?
Yeah, that has been now a new challenge. I feel like in a space program, I was frustrated by the fact that females were only like 23% of the astronaut corps, but I go to the airline industry and they're only about 4% of the commercial airline pilots. So working on creating programs to help advance that, and as you noted, in the industry itself, in boardrooms across industry, females are still so vastly underrepresented. Minorities underrepresented as well, but since females, of course, are 50% of the population, that is something that we know for the future needs to change. And for me, I have felt and looked at a lot of research on this topic. Women tend to like to be in careers where they can really see they're making a positive difference and a change. And we need to better, I think, align STEM careers, aviation careers, and so forth with those kinds of goals to attract more females.
So how do we do that? Because as you said, it really all starts, if you want women in the cockpit, in the boardrooms, it really starts with their education. And unfortunately, those numbers aren't great either about the number of women pursuing careers in STEM. And of those that are, largely they're in the life sciences, right? Biology majors. So what can we do to attract, encourage more young women and especially minorities to pursue STEM degrees?
I think the biology statistic really makes my point. Women are going into medicine at greater rates than men, and I think it's obvious to see that connection to medicine and helping people. We need to show how physicists, how engineers, how pilots help people, how they are positions where there is going to be a collaborative environment that will attract women. And we do continue, I do believe, in role models and being able to have visible women, minorities in these positions where young girls who are making their decisions very early about whether to really take that class seriously in junior high and then high school, and then whether to take it at all in college, are making those decisions. You know, I actually didn't take those classes in college. My high school math, I was through with it by the time I was a junior year, so we're 5 boys. But when I came back in the fall for my senior year, those 5 boys had been channeled into a program at the local university, at Michigan State University, to take calculus. My mom was incensed. No one had reached out to her to make sure that I was in that program as well. It was assumed that a girl would not want to take calculus in high school. We need to make sure those things aren't happening today. I fear there is still a bit of that going on, and a number of programs. I'll highlight Sally Ride Science because we've been talking about her. She was committing the rest of her career to this because of its importance for our future.
You know, Laura, you and I were in high school at about the same time. I was a couple of years ahead of you, but when I was in high school, I went to an all-girls school, and we didn't have AP classes, as an example. If we wanted to take an AP class, we had to go to the boys' high school. So I'm happy to report that many years later, when my daughter wanted to take AP classes, she could take them at her high school and didn't have to travel. So maybe we're making some progress there.
Indeed. Well, I couldn't even wear pants. I look forward to gym day because we got to wear shorts under our dresses. So we have at least come some ways. I have I've been reading it at Women's History Month for a few years now, memo from the late 70s at NASA, where women were told it was a question about whether or not they should be allowed to wear pantsuits to work. And it closed with, well, I guess it's okay, but if you want to be treated like a lady, don't forget it was you who first started to wear the pants. It was an incredible thing in the late 70s. So what I would do at NASA today was to try and say, think about what we're doing and saying now that seems okay, but's not. There are a number of things that we do similar to single out women in this. So many meetings where I was the only woman and people want to comment on your hair. I mean, the Hillary thing is just so obvious. It is no more appropriate to comment on my hair than it is for me to comment on your lack of hair. This is not okay. And we need to be more careful about those kinds of things today.
Today, we're talking with Lori Garver, General Manager of the Airline Pilots Association and former Deputy Administrator of NASA. Coming up, we'll find out what Lori and a member of a famous boy band, NSYNC, have in common. You're listening to Women of Washington with Aileen Black and Gigi Shum on Federal News Radio 1500 AM.
WFED Washington, WWWTFM HD2 Manassas.
Welcome back. You're listening to Women of Washington with Aileen Black and Gigi Shum on Federal News Radio 1500 AM. Today we're talking with Lori Garver, General Manager, Airlines Association and former Deputy Administrator of NASA.
Lori, you actually competed for one of the civilian slots to be an astronaut and take a ride to the space station. And one of your competitors was Lance Bass from NSYNC. Tell us about that.
Oh, so many great stories of that part of my life. I was in I was in the private sector at the time. I was working for an individual who was buying a seat on the Soyuz capsule to go to space station. When he decided he couldn't go, the Russians came to me and said, we really need someone to purchase this seat so that we can continue to have this outside income, dollars, so we can provide these flights to the space station. We were already doing that back in those days, and they needed the capital from outside. And so we began a program, my firm and I, called AstroMom, where I was training in Russia to get medically certified to go to space while being sponsored. So I had sponsors like Radio Shack. I was going to be using Sudafed, which astronauts use in space, but they can't promote that because of their government status. I had credit cards who were competing to sponsor me, Visa and MasterCard. What does mom do when she goes to space? She goes shopping. And certainly Disney was the sponsor for As You Landed, Lori Garver, you just went to space. What are you going to do now? Go to Disneyland. So I'm over in Russia working on this, and I get a call from my office that Lance Bass from NSYNC has decided he's going to go to space in the same seat and is flying over to start training. So I wasn't too concerned about it. I was pretty deep in the program at that point. Lance came over. We had a great time together. We trained on a lot of the same days on a lot of this. The 8 Gs I took in the centrifuge after Lance and I both completed, they told me I did better than Lance. So he was, I think, 23 and I was 40. But they said women tend to do better on that equipment because our heart rate is lower. So these are the same doctors who had tested Yuri Gagarin. So I said, does Yuri Gagarin, did he do the best? Is that why he was chosen to fly? They said, no, he had the best smile. And I looked over at Lance, and he had that great smile. It's like, I know you're going to go instead of me. And it was true. The Russians felt that he would have a better chance getting sponsored. So he stayed for the training longer, and I went home. At one point, I was going to do backup training with him, but then his sponsors didn't manage to raise the money either. But it was a very positive experience, and it was wonderful to be in Russia at a time, as we were talking about, where we were ending this competitive part of the program and working to cooperate in a more peaceful world. And to do that with Lance was just added an amazing twist. It was a lot of fun.
So lost out by a smile, huh?
And a few tens of millions of dollars.
Yeah, exactly. Speaking of rock stars, I heard you say that if you were done with this career, or when you were done with this career, that maybe you would pursue art, pottery perhaps, but that your real desire was to be a rock star. So is that what's next on tap for you, Lori?
Well, you always need an answer for those questions, and certainly when you're deputy administrator of NASA, and people want to know what you're going to do next, the easy answer is rock star. And I've got a son who is an aspiring rock star and has a lot better chance. So rock star mom is probably closer to my agenda. I also do love the creative outlets that I have, and throwing pots has been one I've done since since high school. But no, I'm not ready to throw pots and sing for a living yet. Still need to pay off those college loans, and I think there's more to be done in making the world a better place.
Lori, your success is not limited to your career. You mentioned you have a family. You're very active in the community. How do you do all that? How do you find the time and the balance to make that all work? I mean, what is your secret?
Oh, I have a top 10 list for work-life balance, and it includes the simple things like live close to work. We literally bought a house a block from where I lived for 10 years so I could walk to work. And when the kids were little, I could go home for lunch. I could go home when they were hungry and nurse them. And you want, the logistics are one thing. A BlackBerry, I would argue, kept me able to go to soccer games. And maybe if I was on it and missed the goal, kids never knew. And those kids are now 22 and 19. They're proud of my career. And I don't have a lot of regrets, but it would be not truthful to say there are no regrets. Everybody has regrets. And when I give that talk and there are young mothers and they're making tough choices, I tell them at the end, my list is just really about justifying the choices I made. You're going to make your choices. And while you can have it all, you can't have it all at the same time. There have been times in my career when I was between the Clinton administration and the Obama administration, I worked in the private sector in consulting. I wasn't the leader of that firm. I wasn't taking as much time as I did in those other jobs. And my kids were between the ages of 5 and 14 during those years. So that is a time when I was around more. So I absolutely believe there are many, many ways to achieve it. And the most important thing is that you feel like you are making those choices yourself and doing them in a way which allows you to feel fulfilled. And having gone to my son's graduation, he happened to go to the same college I did, was just up there with the greatest experience. It wasn't about me, it was about him. And he had made those choices and he was graduating. So that's a great aspect of it as well.
Well, he must have done pretty well, Lori, because I saw that not only did he graduate, but he was chosen to give the student speech at graduation. That must have been a proud moment. Tell us a little bit about that.
It sure was. He first wrote that he'd been chosen as one of the 10 students, as voted by the students, to submit a speech. And I kept telling him how proud I was of that and, assuming that would be that. And then and have him not get his hopes up. But then he won, and being there for it again at my alma mater was a very exciting thing. It just so happens that Jane Lubchenco, the former head of NOAA, was the speaker for graduation. And Jane and I got to know each other during our time here. We both were graduates of Colorado College. And she came into the speaker's dinner at the president's house and saw me and thought I was speaking at something, maybe baccalaureate. I said, no, this is my son, Wes. He's the student speaker. And because he's a music major, he played piano that evening at dinner. And being able to have him have that experience was certainly a highlight of not only being a mother, but of my life.
Wow, that's a wonderful story. So, Lori, if you were to go back in time and see Lori going across that commencement stage, and you were to go up to her, what 3 pearls of wisdom would you leave her to help her find her way to have such a distinguished career like you have had?
Well, I think first you have to just say, enjoy it. It is your life. You're going to make your choices. Some of them are not going to be the right ones, but you live each day in a way that you can be proud. And I feel like the advice I probably got from my dad, which I would continue to give, is that don't be afraid to make a choice that you might not be ready for something. I would say that each job I had, I didn't know how to do before I was given it. And sometimes it's hard to say, wow, I don't know how to do that, so I'm not going to apply. As a receptionist bookkeeper for the National Space Society, I didn't know how to keep books. I'd had accounting, but I figured it out. I figured out how to do it and made my way through it. Certainly to head policy at NASA, I didn't know how to do that. Didn't know how to go to space or all the things I did in the private sector. And then finally, it's just so daunting to be nominated by the president to do something like help run an $18 billion agency. You have to just decide you are going to be able to learn that in place. And finally, I would tell women to make sure that they stand up for themselves. Be determined. Be determined to not have your choices limited by anyone else.
That's great advice on especially the area where you're talking about being new at something, because the greatest thing about not knowing the job is not knowing what you can't do. Did you find that was an advantage in people that you're helping mentor, younger people in NASA in your new position? Do you find that as an advantage that you can really leverage?
Sure. You do not want to limit your choices, and you feel like we have maybe done that in the past. One of the things about making the choice to leave NASA and go to the Airline Pilots Association was to do something that I had not done before, and it's an exciting, motivating kind of thing to do.
Lori Garver, General Manager of the Airline Pilots Association and former Deputy Administrator of NASA. Lori, I want to thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, your advice with us today. If you want to know more about Lori and space issues, you can follow her on Twitter at Lori_Garver. I'm Gigi Shum.
And I'm Aileen Black. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to Women of Washington with Aileen Black and Gigi Shum on Federal News Radio 1500 AM. If you missed any part of this program, you can hear the entire show on our website, federalnewsradio.com. Women of Washington, Wednesday mornings at 9 on federalnewsradio.com and 1500 AM.
Welcome, Lori.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Lori, I see that in the early 80s, right out of school, armed with your degrees in political science and economics, you went to work on Capitol Hill in John Glenn's office when he was in the Senate. Is that when you found your love of space and Washington?
Well, I like to think that I've been a big fan, as are a lot of us, of the space program and of our exploration activities beyond the planet Earth for longer than that. Growing up, I was 8 when Neil and Buzz walked on the moon, and I guess I always felt I would get that chance. So working for John Glenn was a thrill, and it did sort of cement a lot of those thoughts in my mind that I wanted to do that in my career.
That was quite a leap at 8 to think that you might get the chance to do that, because even today there are few females up on the Hill and fewer in space. So what was it that made you think that you could be part of that? And how was it back then?
Well, I think all of us grow up certainly with a view that we are going to be part of the broader society, whatever interests us. And so it interested me, and I didn't really feel like there were going to be limits because I was a girl. My mom certainly never instilled that in me. And throughout college, I did not have that. Sally Ride flew in space when I was just graduating from college, and it did seem like a natural thing to do. Of course, coming to Washington on the Hill and in the space program, I've been for the entire 30 years, unfortunately, one of the few women in the room, and I'm hoping, of course, that will change faster than it has the last 30 years, but it's changed some.
Lori, I know that Sally Ride was an early inspiration, not only from your blog, but what you just mentioned, and possibly a mentor to you. How did Sally help shape your career?
Well, while she was an inspiration in college, I definitely felt like I probably would never get to meet her, and the opportunity when I was both at the National Space Society and NASA to start working with her directly was something that she completely fulfilled for me as a mentor, a woman who had decided that she was going to be in a field, went out to do that, and I had the chance, especially during the transition team and as the deputy of NASA, to work with her closely. She helped shape the space program. She really to probably invest in some of these activities more ourselves. The cooperative nature of it has been very positive.
Given the situation in Ukraine, are you concerned about our reliance on Russian right now?
Sure. We should have always been concerned. We were always concerned. It's a partnership, but of course, to have a strong partnership, you need to have your own capability. And while retirement of the shuttle was something that was planned for a long time, it was done for a lot of the right reasons. The mistakes, in my view, were not to be funding earlier the follow-on to the shuttle so that we didn't have to pay the Russians for our astronauts to fly in space. We're now on a very positive track to get our astronauts flying in space through these commercial vehicles. We should have been funding that earlier, and we wouldn't have had this gap. But we did have a gap also between Apollo and shuttle. And with the nation's investment in space, it's very hard to both fly out major expensive missions and develop new ones at the same time. So there have been these gaps.
Today, we're talking with Lori Garver, General Manager of the Airline Pilots Association and former Deputy Administrator of NASA. Coming up, we talk with Lori about the Dragon space vehicle and NASA's changing mission. You're listening to Women of Washington with Aileen Black and Gigi.
Welcome to Women of Washington with Aileen Black and Gigi Shum on Federal News Radio 1500 AM. Women of Washington is a series of weekly radio interviews with Washington, D.C.'s most ambitious and influential female executives, role models for the next generation of Washington leaders. Every Wednesday morning at 9, Aileen and Gigi interview the most accomplished women in Washington who share their life lessons and secrets to success.
I'm Aileen Black.
I'm Gigi Shum.
Today in the studio, we have Lori Garver, General Manager of Airline Pilots Association and former Deputy Administrator of NASA. Our guest today's career spans over 30 years in both the private and the public sector. Today, Lori is General Manager of the Airline Pilots Association. Prior to that, she was nominated by President Obama back in May 2009 and was the Deputy Administrator of NASA. Garver led both the Civil Space Policy Advisors for Obama's 2008 political campaign and led the agency's review team for NASA during the post-election transition. Lori has had numerous positions in the space policy. She was a member of NASA Advisory Council, a guest lecturer at the International Space University, president and board member of the Women in Aerospace, and president of the American Astronautical Society. Lori has a BA from Colorado College and a master's from George Washington University.
Molded a lot of my thoughts on what we should be doing in space, and I'll be forever grateful.
Speaking of what we should be doing in space, you were Deputy Administrator at NASA during a very interesting time. The Cold War had ended, and we'd begun to cooperate with Russia on several projects, including the space station. How did that change NASA's mission?
NASA has always been a geopolitical tool for the United States. Certainly going to Apollo, going to the moon through the Apollo program was a geopolitical response to Sputnik, and the Russians with Yuri Gagarin's flight caused us to invest heavily in the space program. So when we had a situation where we could help advance peaceful cooperation through space, we were right there willing to do that. It was an amazing time to be in my early days at NASA in the 90s there as we first went to Star City, first saw where cosmonauts were trained. I actually trained in a multi-gravity accelerator myself in Star City, Russia, on my 40th birthday. So the opening up of the Russian space program to the United States and now what has been a very successful cooperative relationship has advanced the space program. It's something that while we recognize we need to